Ethan and Maria had always seemed like the perfect couple. Married for 6 years, their bond was one that many of their friends envied. They shared quiet evenings together, discussing their dreams, watching their favorite shows, and planning a future full of hope. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. Ethan had noticed Maria's increasing absences, the way her phone seemed to light up more often than it used to, and the subtle distance that had crept into their conversations. It wasn't something Ethan could put his finger on, but he felt the void growing between them. He dismissed it as the monotony of routine, or perhaps the stress of his demanding job. After all, he trusted Maria implicitly. She was his anchor, the love of his life. If she seemed distracted or distant, there had to be a reasonable explanation. On a Saturday night, Ethan suggested they go to the movies, a pastime they both loved but hadn't indulged in for months. Maria seemed oddly hesitant at first, but when Ethan insisted, she relented with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As they entered the theater, Maria turned to Ethan. "You grab the seats. I'll get us some popcorn," she said, already walking toward the concession stand. Ethan nodded and headed into the dimly lit screening room, choosing 2 seats near the center. He didn't think much of it when Maria didn't return immediately. The line must have been long, he told himself. But as the previews began to roll, a strange feeling settled over him, a small, inexplicable tug in his gut. He brushed it off, focusing on the screen, unaware of the secret rendezvous that was unfolding just a few rows behind him. Maria had slipped into a seat beside someone she had not expected to meet in this way but couldn't resist. The man beside her, tall with an air of easy confidence, was none other than Ethan's father, Richard. What had started as fleeting flirtations at family gatherings had escalated over time into something forbidden, something intoxicating. The quiet theater offered the perfect anonymity, a cocoon for their whispered words and stolen touches. Ethan remained oblivious, sitting alone in the dark, his mind consumed with thoughts of Maria's happiness and their future. Little did he know, the night would mark the beginning of a truth that would unravel everything he believed about love, loyalty, and family. The relationship between Maria and Richard hadn't always been so complicated. In fact, they'd gotten along well from the start, as any daughter-in-law and father-in-law might. Richard, a man in his late 50s, carried himself with a charm that often drew people in. He was charismatic, attentive, and had a way of making people feel seen. Ethan had inherited his looks, but not his father's magnetic persona. Maria had initially dismissed Richard's compliments as harmless. He was always generous with praise, calling her beautiful and commending her wit during family dinners. It had seemed innocent at first, but as months turned into years, she began to notice the way his gaze lingered on her, the subtle shifts in his tone when they spoke. The spark had been lit at a family barbecue. Ethan had been busy flipping burgers on the grill while Richard and Maria had talked under the pretense of discussing wine pairings. Their conversation had veered into more personal territory, a flirtatious banter that had taken both of them by surprise. "It's a shame Ethan works so much," Richard had said, his voice low. "A woman like you deserves someone who notices every little detail." Maria had laughed nervously, brushing off the comment, but her cheeks had flushed all the same. That day marked the beginning of their forbidden connection. From there, stolen moments became a dangerous game. Richard would touch her hand longer than necessary when passing her a dish at the table. Maria found herself looking forward to his jokes, his attention, his presence. It wasn't long before Maria's guilt began to manifest as frustration with Ethan. His long hours at work became a point of contention. His jokes didn't seem as funny anymore. His kisses felt routine. Every time she looked at him, she saw a man so engrossed in providing a future for them that he couldn't see the cracks forming in their present. Richard, on the other hand, made her feel desired in a way she hadn't experienced in years. He listened to her, laughed with her, and, most dangerously, saw her in ways Ethan no longer seemed to. So, when Richard had casually mentioned that he'd be free on the upcoming weekend and asked if she'd be at the theater with Ethan, Maria couldn't stop the thought from taking root. The idea of sneaking away, just for a moment, had seemed thrilling, even harmless. Now, as Maria sat beside him in the dim theater, her heart raced. Not from the movie's suspenseful score, but from the electric charge of their proximity. Ethan was just a few rows ahead, but she barely thought about him. Her world had narrowed to the man beside her, to the choices that had already pushed her over the edge. Maria's palms were clammy as she adjusted herself in the seat, glancing nervously around the dimly lit theater. The previews were still playing, their glow flickering over her face and providing just enough light to catch Richard's smirk. He leaned in close, his voice barely audible over the low rumble of sound effects. "You look stunning tonight," he whispered, his breath brushing against her ear. Maria's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She shouldn't be here. She knew that. Ethan was just a few rows ahead, waiting for her with an oblivious patience that made her stomach churn with guilt. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered back, her voice shaky. Richard placed a hand on hers, his touch firm but gentle. "But you did," he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd let things spiral. Maria stared at the screen, pretending to be engrossed in the previews, but she wasn't seeing anything. All she could focus on was the warmth of Richard's hand, the way her body betrayed her, leaning ever so slightly toward him. "Relax," Richard said softly, his voice rich with confidence. "We're just watching a movie." But they both knew it was more than that. Maria's mind raced with justifications. Ethan wouldn't notice. He never did anymore. He'd probably assume she was stuck in a long line at the concession stand or chatting with a theater employee. Richard, ever the opportunist, seized the moment. He leaned in again, this time brushing his lips against her ear. "You deserve to feel alive, Maria," he murmured. The words hit her like a bolt of lightning. She turned to look at him, her face a mixture of confusion, desire, and guilt. Her lips parted as if to protest, but Richard silenced her with a finger to his lips. His gaze locked onto hers, and for a fleeting moment, the world outside their row ceased to exist. Maria's resolve crumbled. Against her better judgment, she allowed herself to sink into the moment, to feel the thrill of stepping over a line she could never uncross. A sudden burst of laughter from the screen jolted her back to reality. She glanced around, her paranoia rising as she realized how visible they were, even in the darkened theater. She pulled her hand away from Richard's, her voice a harsh whisper. "This is crazy. We can't do this." Richard leaned back, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but the confident smirk that tugged at his lips told her he wasn't the least bit deterred. "Fine," he said casually, his tone playful, "but I think you'll come back." Maria's throat tightened as she stood, casting one last glance at him before hurrying back up the aisle. Ethan was where she'd left him, his eyes fixed on the screen, utterly unaware of the whirlwind of betrayal swirling behind him. She slid into her seat, the popcorn tub she'd forgotten to grab still absent from her hands. Ethan turned to her briefly, offering her a warm smile. "Everything okay? Long line?" he asked. Maria forced a smile, her heart still pounding. "Yeah," she lied. "Just really crowded out there." As Ethan turned back to the movie, Maria stared blankly at the screen, her mind racing. She had crossed a line she couldn't take back, and the guilt gnawed at her, even as a small, dangerous part of her craved more. The ride home that evening was quiet, with only the faint hum of the car engine filling the silence. Ethan occasionally glanced at Maria, sensing something off but choosing not to press. He assumed she was simply tired. It had been a long day, after all. Maria, however, was locked in an internal battle. She sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress as flashes of the evening played over and over in her mind. She could still feel Richard's hand on hers, his voice in her ear, the unspoken invitation that had lingered between them. When they reached home, Ethan turned to her with a tired smile. "You okay?" he asked gently. Maria blinked, startled by the question. "Yeah," she replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired. It's been a long week." Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. He kissed her forehead and headed upstairs to get ready for bed, leaving Maria alone in the living room. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. What was she doing? How had it come to this? Ethan was a good man, a kind man. He didn't deserve any of this. And yet, the thrill of her encounter with Richard had ignited something in her she hadn't felt in years, a sense of being seen, of being desired. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her spiral of thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, her stomach sinking when she saw the name on the screen. Richard. She stared at the message for a moment before opening it. Richard, I can still feel you next to me. Tell me you didn't feel it too. Maria's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She shouldn't respond. She knew that. But her heart raced at the memory of the moment they'd shared, and against her better judgment, she typed back. Maria, it was a mistake. It can't happen again. The reply came almost instantly. Richard, mistake or not, it happened. I'm not sorry for it, and I don't think you are either. Maria's breath hitched. She put her phone down and rubbed her temples, trying to shake the weight of his words. He wasn't wrong. She wasn't sorry. And that was what scared her the most. Upstairs, Ethan called out, Are you coming to bed? Maria jolted, the sound of his voice slicing through her thoughts. Yeah, she called back. Just a minute. As she climbed the stairs, her phone vibrated again, but she didn't dare look. Instead, she slipped into bed beside Ethan, her back turned to him, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She told herself this was it, that she would put an end to whatever had started tonight. But deep down, she knew the truth. A door had been opened, and closing it wouldn't be as simple as she hoped. The next day, life went on as usual, or so it seemed. Ethan left for work early, kissing Maria goodbye as he always did. She waved from the doorway, watching his car disappear down the street, and felt the familiar pang of guilt gnawing at her. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she didn't hesitate. Richard, coffee at 11? Same place as before. Maria stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. She told herself it was just coffee, that it didn't mean anything. But even as she typed her reply, she knew she was lying to herself. Maria. Okay. With a mix of anticipation and dread swirling in her chest, Maria set the phone down. She had chosen to walk the edge of a knife, knowing full well the damage it could do. Maria arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she parked. The small coffee shop was one they'd used before for family outings, a neutral, unassuming place. But now, it felt charged with tension. She sat in her car, debating whether to leave. She could back out now, head home, and pretend this wasn't happening. But as she sat there, the sight of Richard pulling into the lot sealed her decision. His car came to a stop, and he stepped out, his confident stride making her pulse quicken. Maria took a deep breath, grabbed her purse, and exited the car. The sound of her heels clicking against the pavement matched the rhythm of her racing heart. Richard held the door open for her, his smile warm but laced with something else, something dangerous. You came, he said simply. I shouldn't have, Maria replied, stepping past him into the shop. They ordered their drinks and chose a table in the far corner, away from the handful of other patrons. The tension between them was palpable, and Maria found herself fiddling with her cup, avoiding Richard's gaze. Why did you agree to this? He asked finally, his voice low. Maria's eyes darted up to meet his. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe I needed closure. To end whatever this is. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. Is that really what you want? To end it? Maria opened her mouth to respond but faltered. Did she want to end it? Every rational part of her screamed yes, but the pull she felt toward Richard was undeniable. He made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. Richard, this is wrong, she said finally, her voice trembling. Is it? He countered, leaning forward. Or does it just feel wrong because someone told you it should? Maria looked away, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. She hated how easily he could unnerve her, how his words seemed to echo the thoughts she'd been trying to bury. This isn't fair to Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's expression softened, but there was still a glint of determination in his eyes. Ethan doesn't see you, Maria. Not the way I do. The words struck a chord she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about attraction. Richard made her feel seen. as though the parts of herself that had faded in her marriage were suddenly illuminated. "I can't do this," she said, standing abruptly. "I'm sorry, but I can't." Richard rose as well, his gaze steady. "I'll respect your decision, Maria, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me." Maria nodded, her throat tight. She turned and left the cafe, the weight of his gaze following her out the door. For the rest of the day, Maria tried to focus on anything but Richard. She cleaned the house, ran errands, and even forced herself to read. But her thoughts kept drifting back to him. His words replayed in her mind, feeding the storm of emotions she was trying so hard to quell. When Ethan came home that evening, she greeted him with forced enthusiasm, cooking his favorite meal in an attempt to bury her guilt. They talked about his day, about mundane things, but Maria could feel the chasm widening between them. Later that night, as Ethan slept beside her, Maria stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy with conflict. She had walked away from Richard today, but she wasn't sure how long she could resist the pull. She hated herself for it, but deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions for Maria. She buried herself in routine, hoping the predictability of her daily life would drown out the chaos in her mind. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't escape the lingering sense of Richard. His words, his touch, his presence. Ethan, ever the devoted husband, remained oblivious. He continued with his usual habits, early mornings at the office, late nights spent unwinding with Maria in front of the television. He didn't notice the way her phone seemed glued to her hand more often, or the way her laughter felt hollow when he told his usual jokes. Maria's resolve cracked one rainy afternoon when a message from Richard appeared on her phone. "Richard, I haven't stopped thinking about you." She stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. Every ounce of logic told her to delete the message, to block his number, to finally put an end to this. But instead, her fingers betrayed her, typing a response before she could think better of it. "Maria, we can't keep doing this." His reply came almost immediately. "Richard, then tell me to stop. Tell me you feel nothing, and I'll leave you alone." Maria's chest tightened. She couldn't bring herself to type the words because they would be a lie. Instead, she threw the phone onto the couch and walked away, hoping distance would quiet the storm inside her. But Richard wasn't one to give up so easily. Later that evening, another message arrived, more direct this time. "Richard, meet me tomorrow. No excuses." Maria stared at the words, her heart pounding. She knew what this was, a choice, a turning point. If she went, there would be no going back. But a part of her, the part that craved the spark Richard had reignited, couldn't say no. The following afternoon, Maria found herself driving to a secluded park on the outskirts of town. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She felt like a woman on the verge of self-destruction, every mile bringing her closer to the edge. When she arrived, Richard was already there, leaning against his car. His casual confidence set her nerves on edge, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice warm as she approached. Maria stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms. "What do you want, Richard?" He smiled, a mix of charm and mischief. "I think you know." She shook her head, trying to maintain her composure. "This is wrong," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Richard stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "Do you really believe that?" Maria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Richard closed the distance between them. His hand cupped her cheek, and his lips pressed against hers in a kiss that sent a shockwave through her entire body. For a moment, she froze, torn between resistance and surrender. But as his arms wrapped around her, she gave in, the weight of her guilt drowned out by the intensity of the moment. When they finally pulled apart, Maria's breath came in short, ragged bursts. "What are we doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard's eyes searched hers, his expression softening. "Something we both want," he said simply. Maria didn't respond. She couldn't. All she could do was stand there, teetering on the edge of a choice she knew would change everything. Maria sat in her car for a long time after leaving the park, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. The kiss lingered on her lips, a haunting reminder of what she had done and what she was rapidly becoming. She knew she should feel remorse. She should go straight home, confess everything to Ethan, and beg for forgiveness. But instead, she found herself driving aimlessly, trying to process the tangled mess of emotions roiling inside her. When she finally returned home, Ethan was in the kitchen, humming softly as he stirred a pot of soup on the stove. The sight of him, so domestic, so steady, sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over her. "Hey, there you are," he said, glancing up with a smile. "I was starting to wonder if you got lost." Maria forced a laugh, setting her purse down on the counter. "Just ran a few errands," she said, her voice too light, too casual. Ethan didn't seem to notice. He gestured toward the stove. "Dinner will be ready in a few minutes. Why don't you go relax for a bit?" Maria nodded, retreating to the bedroom. Once the door was closed behind her, she sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. She thought about Richard, about the way he had looked at her, the way he had kissed her like she was the only woman in the world. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and her stomach twisted when she saw Richard's name on the screen. "Richard, I can't stop thinking about you. Let's meet again soon." Maria's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to tell him no, to put an end to this before it spiraled any further out of control. But her resolve faltered as she thought about how alive she had felt in his arms. "Maria, we need to be careful. This can't go any further." The response came quickly. "Richard, you say that, but I don't believe you." Maria stared at the message, her heart pounding. He was right. She didn't believe herself either. Over the next few weeks, the affair deepened. Richard was relentless, finding excuses to see her, to steal moments that felt both exhilarating and forbidden. They met in hidden corners of town, sharing stolen kisses and whispered confessions. Maria tried to maintain the facade of her normal life, but it became harder with each passing day. Ethan noticed her distraction, asking if everything was okay, but she brushed off his concerns with forced smiles and vague reassurances. Meanwhile, Richard grew bolder. He would text her late at night, sending messages that made her heart race even as they filled her with dread. "Richard, I want more, Maria. I want all of you." She knew the risk, knew the devastation it would cause if Ethan found out. But with every meeting, every touch, she felt herself sinking deeper into the web of deceit they had spun. It wasn't love, it couldn't be, but it was something powerful, something that filled the void she hadn't even realized was there. And though she told herself she could stop at any time, deep down, Maria knew the truth. She was in too deep, and the cracks in her life were about to shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Ethan began noticing the changes in Maria. At first, they were subtle. Her distracted replies, the way she always seemed to be on her phone, and her sudden bursts of energy followed by long stretches of silence. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, they'd been married long enough for him to know that life ebbed and flowed. But there were moments that stuck with him, nagging at the back of his mind. Like the time he'd come home early and found Maria hastily shutting her laptop, her face flushed as though she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. "Work stuff," she'd said with a nervous laugh. "Just some emails." Ethan had nodded, though something about her tone didn't sit right. Then there was the sudden surge of errands, grocery runs that took twice as long as they used to, or impromptu meetups with friends he'd never heard of before. When Ethan suggested tagging along one afternoon, Maria had panicked, fumbling for an excuse that only raised more questions. "You wouldn't enjoy it," she'd said quickly. "It's just boring stuff. I'll be back soon." Ethan watched her leave, unease settling over him like a heavy fog. Maria, meanwhile, was living on the edge. Every encounter with Richard felt like walking a tightrope, the thrill of their affair tempered by the constant fear of being discovered. They had grown more reckless, meeting in increasingly risky places, their need for each other outweighing their caution. One afternoon, they found themselves in Richard's car, parked on a quiet stretch of road. The windows were fogged, their whispered conversation punctuated by stolen kisses. "You're going to get us caught," Maria said breathlessly, pushing him away as her cheeks flushed. Richard smirked, his hand brushing against hers. "Only if you don't trust me." Maria sighed, her resolve weakening. She wanted to stop. She really did. But the pull of Richard's presence was magnetic, irresistible. The sound of a car passing jolted her back to reality. She pulled away, her heart racing. "We need to be more careful," she said, her voice shaking. Richard's expression softened. "You worry too much," he said, but he relented, starting the car and driving her back to her own vehicle. That evening, Ethan suggested a date night, a rare treat given his busy schedule. Maria hesitated, guilt gnawing at her, but she agreed, hoping it would ease the tension she could sense building between them. As they sat across from each other at a cozy restaurant, Ethan studied her intently. "You've seemed different lately," he said, his tone careful. "Is everything okay?" Maria froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Different? How?" Ethan shrugged, his gaze steady. "I don't know. Distracted. Maybe. Distant." Maria forced a laugh, setting her fork down. "It's just work," she said quickly. "Things have been stressful lately. I'm sorry if I've been off." Ethan nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "If something's wrong, you can tell me, you know. We're a team." Maria's chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I know," she said softly, "and I'm fine. I promise." But as Ethan smiled, clearly reassured, Maria felt the weight of her lies pressing down on her. She wasn't fine, and she was running out of ways to keep the truth hidden. Ethan's growing unease finally reached a breaking point one Friday evening. He had come home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise Maria with dinner from her favorite restaurant. But the moment he stepped into the house, he sensed something was off. Maria wasn't in the kitchen or the living room, where she usually waited for him. Instead, her muffled voice drifted down from upstairs. Curious, Ethan set the food on the counter and climbed the stairs, following the sound. As he approached the bedroom, her voice became clearer. She was speaking in hushed tones, her words tinged with urgency. "I told you we need to be careful," she said. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He moved closer, careful to stay out of sight, and peered through the slightly ajar door. Maria sat on the edge of the bed, her phone pressed to her ear. "No, I can't meet you tonight," she continued, her tone firm. "Ethan's home. Just don't call me until I say it's safe." Ethan's stomach dropped. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse under the weight of what he was hearing. His wife, the woman he had devoted his life to, was hiding something. Steeling himself, Ethan pushed the door open. Maria's head snapped up, her face draining of color as she saw him standing there. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the bed. "Who were you talking to?" Ethan asked, his voice low and steady. Maria stammered, her eyes darting between him and the phone. "It was just—" "Don't lie to me," Ethan interrupted, his tone sharper now. "I heard you, Maria. I'm not stupid." Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized there was no escaping this. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "Is it someone else?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking. "Are you cheating on me?" Maria's silence was answer enough. Ethan staggered back, his hands running through his hair as he struggled to process the betrayal. "How long?" he demanded, his voice rising. "How long has this been going on?" Maria stood, reaching for him, but he recoiled. "Ethan, please, How long?" he repeated, his tone colder now. "Months," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The word hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of heartbreak and fury. "Who?" Maria hesitated, her lips trembling as she tried to form the words. "Ethan, it's Richard." The room spun. Ethan stumbled back, gripping the doorframe for support as her confession sank in. His father. His own father. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. This wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything he could have imagined. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Maria called after him, her voice desperate. But he didn't stop. He grabbed his keys and drove aimlessly, his mind racing with anger and disbelief. The two people he trusted most had shattered his world in the most unforgivable way. But as his fury burned brighter, so did something else, a dark, vengeful determination. If Maria and Richard thought they could humiliate him, they were wrong. Ethan wasn't going to take this lying down. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of anger and disbelief as he drove aimlessly through the city. Every memory of Maria and Richard felt like a cruel joke, taunting him with the depth of their betrayal. How could they? The woman he loved and the man he admired had conspired to destroy him. But anger soon gave way to clarity. Ethan wasn't a man who took things lying down. If Maria and Richard thought they could betray him without consequences, they were sorely mistaken. He was going to make them pay. Not just Maria, but Richard too. Pulling over at a quiet park, Ethan sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the beginnings of a plan took shape in his mind. If Maria wanted to throw their marriage away, fine. He wouldn't stop her. But he wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. And what better way to do that than by hitting her where it hurt most? Maria's mother, Elaine, had always been a sore spot for her. Their relationship was tense, marked by years of unresolved arguments and misunderstandings. But Ethan had always gotten along with Elaine. In fact, she often confided in him, praising him for his patience and loyalty, qualities she thought Maria didn't fully appreciate. Ethan's lips curled into a bitter smile as the pieces of his plan fell into place. If Maria could betray him with his family, then he would do the same to her. The next day, Ethan reached out to Elaine. He played the role of the wounded husband perfectly, carefully omitting any mention of Richard. Instead, he told her that Maria had been unfaithful, leaving him devastated and unsure of what to do next. Elaine was furious, not at Ethan, but at Maria. "I always told her she didn't deserve you," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "I can't believe she would do this to you." Ethan leaned into her sympathy, subtly steering the conversation toward a more personal tone. He shared his feelings of betrayal, his loneliness, and his longing for understanding. Elaine listened intently, her eyes softening as she placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You've always been like a son to me," she said, her voice warm. "You don't deserve this, Ethan. You're a good man." Ethan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate that, Elaine. I really do. I don't know what I would do without you." The bond between them grew over the next few weeks as Ethan continued to confide in her. He visited her often, under the guise of seeking advice, and Elaine welcomed him with open arms. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before his plan came to fruition. One evening, as they sat together in Elaine's living room, the air between them shifted. They had been talking about Maria, about the choices she had made and the pain she had caused, when Elaine reached over and took Ethan's hand. "You deserve better," she said softly, her eyes searching his. Ethan held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Do I?" he asked, his voice low. Elaine nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. "You do. You deserve someone who sees you for who you are, who appreciates you." The moment hung heavy between them, charged with unspoken tension. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, their lips met. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, fueled by months of suppressed emotions. For Ethan, it was a victory, a calculated move in his game of revenge. For Elaine, it was a chance to feel desired and cherished in a way she hadn't in years. When they finally pulled apart, Elaine looked at him with a mix of surprise and longing. "Ethan, are you sure about this?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I've never been more sure of anything." As they embraced, Ethan felt a grim satisfaction settle over him. Maria had underestimated him, and now, she was about to learn just how devastating betrayal could be. Ethan's relationship with Elaine deepened over the next few weeks, becoming both a source of comfort and a weapon of revenge. He didn't plan to keep it a secret for long. After all, what was the point of retaliation if the target never knew? Maria, for her part, was walking on eggshells. Since Ethan's discovery of the affair, he had been cold and distant, but he hadn't brought up divorce or thrown her out. that left her in a constant state of anxiety, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One evening, Ethan came home with an unfamiliar calmness about him. Maria noticed it immediately and braced herself for whatever was coming. "Maria, we need to talk," he said, his tone steady. She nodded, her hands trembling as she sat on the couch. Ethan remained standing, his presence towering over her. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've done," he began. "About the lies, the betrayal. You didn't just cheat on me. You destroyed my trust, my faith in you, in us." Tears streamed down Maria's face. "Ethan, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I know I messed up, but I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "It's too late for that, Maria. You didn't just cheat with anyone. You slept with my father. Do you even understand how deep that cuts?" Maria sobbed, unable to meet his gaze. "But you don't need to worry," Ethan continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "because I've found someone who does appreciate me, someone who understands what it means to be loyal." Maria's head shot up, confusion flashing across her face. "What are you talking about?" Ethan smirked. "Elaine." Maria froze, her blood running cold. "What?" "You heard me," Ethan said, his words laced with venom. "Your mother and I have been spending a lot of time together. And unlike you, she knows how to treat me with respect." Maria's jaw dropped as she stared at him in disbelief. "You're lying." Ethan pulled out his phone and scrolled through a gallery of photos before holding it out to her. The images showed him and Elaine together, some innocent, others undeniably intimate. You're disgusting," Maria stammered, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. Ethan laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the room. "Am I? Or am I just showing you what betrayal feels like?" Maria's tears of sorrow turned to fury. "How could you do this to me?" To her. "You don't get to play the victim," Ethan snapped, his expression hardening. "You made your choice, Maria. You chose to destroy our marriage, to humiliate me. Don't be surprised when I fight back." Maria stood, her hands clenched into fists. "You're cruel." "No, Maria," Ethan said, his voice cold. "I'm just done being your fool." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Maria to grapple with the fallout of her own actions, and the knowledge that Ethan had turned her world upside down, just as she had done to his. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotional chaos for both Ethan and Maria. The revelation of Ethan's relationship with Elaine sent shockwaves through their already crumbling marriage. Maria vacillated between fury and heartbreak, her pleas for forgiveness morphing into bitter accusations. "You've destroyed everything," Maria screamed during one of their many heated arguments. Ethan stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't destroy anything, Maria. You did. I'm just finishing what you started." Elaine, meanwhile, was torn between guilt and defiance. She and Maria had never been particularly close, but the betrayal of taking up with her son-in-law wasn't lost on her. Yet, she couldn't deny the way Ethan made her feel, valued, appreciated, and desired. "I didn't plan for this to happen," Elaine told Maria during a tense confrontation. "But maybe you should look at yourself before blaming me." The final blow came when Ethan officially filed for divorce. The evidence of Maria's infidelity, especially with someone as close as Richard, gave him a significant advantage. Maria's attempts to fight back fell flat, and the divorce proceedings moved quickly. The day the divorce was finalized, Ethan felt an odd sense of relief. Standing outside the courthouse, he inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. It wasn't just freedom from Maria he felt. It was freedom from the lies, the pain, and the betrayal. Elaine joined him a few moments later, her expression tentative. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. Ethan glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Lighter." She nodded, her gaze searching his. "I know this hasn't been easy. For either of us." "No, it hasn't," Ethan admitted. He paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "But I think I'm finally ready to move forward." Elaine hesitated before reaching for his hand. "And what does that look like for you?" Ethan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "It looks like starting over, building something real, with someone who values honesty and trust. Elaine smiled, her grip tightening on his hand. Then let's start over together. As for Maria, the aftermath of the divorce was a sobering experience. Cut off from Ethan and estranged from her mother, she found herself grappling with the consequences of her actions. Richard had vanished from her life, their affair crumbling under the weight of exposure. Left to rebuild on her own, Maria began to reflect on the choices she had made. The betrayal, the lies, the selfish pursuit of fleeting excitement. It had all led to nothing but loss. Meanwhile, Ethan and Elaine charted a cautious path forward. Their relationship, born out of pain and revenge, began to evolve into something more. It wasn't easy, and they both knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a sense of hope. He had survived the storm, and now it was time to embrace the calm.